Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now, here's your host, Matt Cicoria.
Doctors Matt Tincanti and John Barrero, welcome again to the, John, I'm losing count which one this is. We're in the 20s, I know. But
Are we already?
The Inside Java series on behavioral observations. I really, really enjoy these sessions with you, John, and with all these fantastic Java authors that we get to bring on and talk about really cool papers. And this one's definitely in that category. So, Matt Tincanti, thank you for joining me to talk about this paper. The paper is Extensions of Open Science for Applied Behavior Analysis, Pre-Registration for Single Case Experimental Designs. And that's a paper that you co-wrote with Sean Gilroy and Art Dowdy. So, So before we get into the paper itself, I'd like you to have the opportunity to tell listeners a little bit about yourself, how you got into this field, and then kind of bring us up to speed to what you're doing these days.
Yeah, sure. And thank you, Matt, and thank you, John, for inviting me on. Thank you, John, for suggesting it. I was really, really excited to talk about open science practices and pre-registration. I hope this is helpful for folks if they are learning about open science practices or they're considering pre-registration. Hopefully, this can help them through that process. So I've been in the field now for it's hard to believe, for a little over 30 years. I got my start in ABA in 1993 when I was in college, and I took a course called Behavior Modification. That was actually an applied behavior analysis course. The professor for the course used Keith Miller's textbook on applied behavior analysis, and I thought at that point in psychology, it was the first thing. This was like the first perspective in psychology that like really resonated with me and made sense to me. And I remember seeing like single case graphs and thinking like, oh, this just makes sense to me. And so I had an opportunity at that time to work as what at that time, well, today I think I would have been an RBT, a registered behavior technician, but at that time we were called ABA therapists or LOVAS therapists. And I started implementing early intensive behavioral intervention programs with like young kids with autism, young autistic kids. And I kind of stuck with it from there. Ultimately, I got my PhD in special education and applied behavior analysis from The Ohio State University, as they like to call it. And so that was in 2002. I was at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas for 6 years in a faculty position. I was an assistant professor in special education there. And then in 2008, I transitioned to Temple University, and I teach in the master's program in applied behavior analysis at Temple University. We have a great master's program. It's vibrant and it's now growing. Currently, my research interests focus on, I'm very focused on technology and the integration of technology with applied behavior analysis. And in the last couple of years, with the big explosion in large language models and ChatGPT, I'm actually working with a team of computer scientists and other social and behavioral sciences researchers and behavior analysts to try to integrate large language models into kind of supports and interventions for neurodivergent people, mainly autistic people. Is a particular higher education and employment are specific interests that I have right now. But I would say like 5, 6, 7 years ago, my interests or one kind of strand of my research sort of turned towards meta science issues. So that's like, essentially studying the behavior of scientists. And I think that's when I started to become very interested in some of the issues that are addressed in the pre-registration paper. And that's sort of like when I became initially aware of open science and open science practices. So that strand of my work sort of turned in that direction. And I guess that's why I'm here.
Awesome. Just out of curiosity, where did you have that undergraduate experience where you got to work with kids with autism right out of the gate? That sounds like a really cool. opportunity?
Yeah. So yeah, it was at Westchester University of Pennsylvania in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and Phil Duncan, who I think Phil did his PhD at the University of Florida, and I think he did a master's degree at Western Michigan University. Of course, that was when the field was like a lot smaller. So just by luck and serendipity, I just ran into him, and that really, that really just changed the trajectory of my life. And I live in Westchester, Pennsylvania. This is the area where I'm from, so it's full circle, and I haven't gone very far.
I see. Right. Was it like right where Route 1 meets 202, if I recall correctly, or in that neck of the woods?
Yeah, that's pretty close. Yep, 202 and Route 1. Yeah, it's basically Westchester.
Got it. I spent some formative time just on the other side of the border in Delaware. So anyway, history lesson notwithstanding, I'm really interested in this paper that you shared with us. So, when John pitched this idea to me, I was like, I know very little about this, but upon some reflection, some of this stuff has been kind of percolating at least into my consciousness a little bit just by people I follow on Twitter or X or whatever. And, so I'm starting to see scientists announce, pre-registration of this, that, or the other thing. And before I knew what pre-registration was, I would assume that someone was announcing the publication of a paper. And this is how little I knew about it. I would click on it. It's like, this hasn't been done yet. So this is just saying I'm going to do this. So I guess my first question here is, in a clumsy way, I suppose, is that what this is all about? Do I have the idea of open? So maybe you could walk us through what open science practices are generally, and then also talk about pre-registration, and then I've got some more specific questions relative to that. But if you can maybe just set the table for the listeners and give us a broad view of what all this is about, and then we can get into more specifics.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. And Matt, your anecdote is, I think it's a telling one. And I think that these practices, they're certainly very new in the ABA research community. And I think it's fair to say that they're new to many researchers in general, although in certain research fields, there's been more uptake than others. But like, for example, I fairly recently pre-registered a systematic review on the open science framework. And when you do that, there's a DOI that's generated. It's a digital object identifier, and it's basically a sort of like a universal marker for whatever's being published on the internet. And that got picked up by Google Scholar, and it somehow got picked up by, I'm not sure how all these things work, but it got picked up by ResearchGate, which is basically like a sort of social media for researchers, which I encourage people to, folks, whether you're a researcher or not, if you're just interested in reading about research, oftentimes you can find research papers there that may be of interest to you or relevant to your practice. And you can, maybe get copies of a research paper there that you might not be able to get just freely on the internet. But so the pre-registration for this project was published on ResearchGate, which was it was like a great thing because it actually put the information about the project out there to folks. And, and I heard from, somebody who's doing a very similar research project. And so that could set the occasion for, collaboration and help me do my research. But folks, I think, thought that I had done, like, some people thought, like, well, you're publishing a study, like you've done the study, like they just saw it there. And then people were asking me for the paper, and I had to explain, like, well, it's just a pre-registration. It's not, we haven't actually done the study yet and published the manuscript. So, but, so people are learning. And so you asked me to go back to the original question. You asked me, like, sort of like, what are open science practices? So in general, these are a set of practices that are aimed at enhancing the transparency, accessibility, and general openness of research. So that's sort of like the bigger kind of umbrella of what people oftentimes call the open science movement. So the practices of open science sort of are aligned with that broader goal. So we have preprints, I wasn't describing a preprint, I was describing a pre-registration, but preprints is when you post a peer-reviewed version of a manuscript on a preprint server. Pre-registration is when you make plans for your research public, before the outcomes of the research are available. And that's typically before you've conducted the study. There's open data sharing, which is making research data for a project publicly available. And then there's also registered reports. So that's a type of publication in which a proposal for a research project is submitted to a journal for publication prior to you actually doing the study, prior to the authors doing the study. And then if it's accepted, the paper will be published if the authors reasonably adhere to the proposal. Now, so those are kind of four, I would say, four of the bigger open science practices, although registered reports is one that I think fewer folks are doing that. Those aren't the only open science practices. So there's open peer review, there's team science, there's even something called adversarial research. But preprints, pre-registration, open data sharing, registered reports, I'd say those are the kind of the big four, or so some of the more prevalent practices.
Excuse me, Matt, could you please describe the preprint process just one more time?
Sure. So I just posted a preprint, so it's fresh in my memory. So a preprint is when you publish on a preprint repository a manuscript before it's been peer reviewed. So it's the pre-peer reviewed version of a manuscript that you would post on a repository. So, for example, the Open Science Framework is one of those repositories. And once you publish a preprint, it gets assigned its own DOI, and then it's actually searchable in Google Scholar, so people can find your paper that way. You didn't ask this, but I think so. Someone might say, "Well, what's the purpose of that?" Well, the purpose of that is basically to get your work out there before the peer review process has been finished. And so the paper that I just posted as a preprint, or my co-authors and I posted as a preprint, is one from a project where we interviewed a pretty large group, 63 single case experimental design researchers, about their views and perspectives on questionable research practices and improved research practices. And it's a study that we did like a couple years ago, and it just took us a while to kind of sift through all the data and to get a manuscript written. But we wanted to be able to get the findings of the study, get the manuscript out there. And we knew that, as you know, John, I mean, peer review, although job is great. I mean, you folks do a wonderful job getting manuscripts through the process quickly, but it can take a while. It could take 6 months, 9 months, a year, over a year for a manuscript to be published. So getting it out there as a preprint is one way to disseminate your work. Now, there's a trade-off to that, and the trade-off to that is you've got a manuscript out there that hasn't been peer reviewed yet, and so it's possible that the ultimate that's the penultimate version of the manuscript at best, but it's possible that the final version of the published version of the paper is going to look different, and it's also possible that hopefully likely that the paper is going to get better with the peer review process. So that would be a trade-off.
Okay. So one of the things, looking the focus of the papers and the pre-reg process. So I guess what are, why do people do this? Why did this practice come to be? Was this a set of problems that were pervasive out there that these open science practices and specifically pre-registration solves? What's the point, if you will?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that open science practices are focused on addressing a particular set of problems per se, but there are a few major reasons why researchers have advocated for them. And so when I started to become interested in this topic, like several years ago, it was in part based upon my experience with my own dissertation. So when I got my PhD from Ohio State, my dissertation had 4 participants in it, and it was a comparison of the picture exchange communication system with sign language on essentially communication behaviors of students who were autistic or had other intellectual and developmental disabilities. And when I submitted my findings to the journal with the 4 participants during the editorial process, it was suggested that I remove 2 of the participants. And those were 2 participants whose data had reflected essentially less robust experimental control. And the editor of the journal was wonderful. It was a really great editorial process. And it was kind of like, well, you really have 2 studies here. So here, we have one study or one paper with these two participants. And then, you should submit a subsequent paper with the other 2 participants. And I just never did that. So the folks who are reading that published study would likely assume that there are only 2 participants in the study when in reality there were 4. However, if I had pre-registered that study and it was, and I indicated in the pre-registration that there were 4 participants, folks would be able to compare the pre-registration with the published study subsequently and know that I was reporting the data for only a subset. So one sort of onus for pre-registration in open science practices is and I think that the big take home point the big rationale that I'd like to communicate to folks is that it's about visibility and it's about transparency. Like it's just about transparency. It's about communicating what you did. And in many cases, communicating what you did and providing a rationale for it. So it's not just that, like, when people hear pre-registration and they're afraid that they're going to be just completely committed to the procedures that they pre-register, but that's not the case.
Yeah, we'll get to the objections here in a minute, but
okay. So I'm jumping the gun a little bit.
Yeah, I guess one of the things this is an interesting anecdote because one of the things I wanted to ask is you mentioned the replication crisis in psychology, yes, which I think most folks just even that's probably permeated the almost popular culture in some respects, depending on what media sources you consume. But there's my very little understanding of this thought that this is these open science practices might be a response to the replication crisis, and we tend to think of those things more in the realm of personality and social psychology, and I'm not trying to rag on any discipline in particular, but it's just the nature of those research designs, big N groups designs. I think a lot of folks in our camp would argue that those are more susceptible to difficulties in replication. And so, I can imagine there's a number of people listening to this who, are very much committed to single case design and be like, okay, well, that's a you problem, not a me problem. Speaking of, to this issue of this being more of that open science practices being a solution to some sort of replication problem that has more to do with research practices that are of kind of large N groups designs, and that we in behavior analysis, this is unnecessary. This is an encumbrance, if you will. So I like that anecdote of the decision process, whether you did it or not, to either include or omit participants in that dissertations.
Yeah,
that was a helpful example.
Yeah. So and I think you're right. So the replication crisis has been something that's primarily been focused on and documented in group designs. And you might have been alluding to this, but in 2015, the Open Science Foundation, as I mentioned before, they conducted what they called the reproducibility project, and they attempted to replicate 100 studies in 3 pretty prominent psychology journals. And the mean effect size of the replicated studies they found was less than half of the original studies, and they attributed this to the likelihood maybe of selective reporting in those studies, selective data reporting, or maybe the original researchers were kind of fudging their statistics in certain ways that were making the findings look more robust. Yeah, like p-hacking. Yeah, p-hacking, which would be, for example, changing the p-value for significant results from the 0.01 level to the 0.05 level. It would be like running a bunch of different statistical tests and then on kind of selecting a subset that sort of make the data look better, or at least make the data conform to the directions of your hypothesis. So yeah, so behavior analysts, researchers might sort of like look at this and think that this is stuff that, it's like it only applies to other people. And while it's true that the replicability crisis has been focused on group designs, what is, if you think about it from the perspective of contingencies, so what are the contingencies that would contribute to questionable research practices with any type of research like design? So like, well, it's like you have contingencies that are associated with contributing to, a robust, scientific literature that's valid. And then you also have contingencies that are more directly associated with publications. Like you get, you publish, and if you're an academic like John and me, you get more citations. That helps you get promotion and tenure. If you've developed an intervention and you're evaluating it, and the results of a study on the intervention look positive for the intervention, there's an incentive for you to publish that. So the contingencies for questionable practices in single case designs are probably not any different than they are for group designs and in group research, but questionable research practices in single case probably look different. Like the topographies are different because the research that we do is very different. And so some of the kinds of questionable practices that open science practices are attempting to address are just going to be unique to our design. So, for example, you could drop a participant's data set if that particular data set or that case doesn't show robust experimental control. You could omit data points from a graph that show visual instability. You could scale the axes of a graph in such a way to make the data look a certain way visually. So there probably are a set of questionable practices that are specific to single case design, which is why I think we need to be paying close attention to this. And I just want to mention that I've been doing a separate research project with Tim Slocum, Art Dowdy, and Jason Travers, where we're examining these issues. And I think I might have mentioned it before, and so that's so some of those questionable practices, that's sort of where they come from.
So when you said the changing the axes, all of my friends in the precision teaching community right now are probably breathing in and out of paper bags, because they'd be yelling at their phones right now saying, this is not necessary if everyone used the standard acceleration chart. And but anyway, that's an aside.
No, that's absolutely true. And if that was the world that we lived in, that problem would be solved.
And I think Rick Cabina did a very, very, and some colleagues published a paper a few years ago looking at the number of graphs in major ABA journals and how some of the graphing conventions were, routinely violated. And so anyway, I'll try to run that paper down and put that in the show notes if people want to check that out too. And I'll actually tag that original episode I did with Rick also. So, John, I'm curious, as the editor-in-chief of JABA, what your take on all this is, from someone who just reads all sorts of everything that comes across the door or comes across the threshold or what have you of the halls of JABA. I'm curious just what your general thoughts are on this. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I think one aspect that I'd like to respond to in terms of what Matt was just describing there is that the pre-registration itself doesn't solve the problems that you just described. I think it shines a light on them. So, for example, researchers could still scale their y-axes in funky and distorted ways, but to your point, the pre-registration permits others to evaluate that work and draw attention to those potential practices.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely true, and that's a great point, John. It's not pre-registration is not necessarily going to solve all of these problems. And I mean, you could fudge a pre-registration. I'm not saying that happens frequently, but I mean, it's possible that it's it's possible that you could, it's pre-registration could be fudged. So yeah, it's a really good point.
Yeah. So in response to how this looks at Java, I have a few different thoughts about this. And one is that I think there's a way to think about this approach as sort of consistent with a self-control paradigm. At this point, the replication crisis has not directly systematically impacted single case experimental design research. That's, as Matt C. pointed out, that's sort of the other people's problem in one respect. However, if we engage in a bit more effort at this stage in the process, there may be important downstream benefits to the approach. So, for example, large data repositories that address a particular kind of behavioral intervention. So we take our research from 3 studies to 20 or 30 studies that now get us on the order of 60 or 100 participants. So I think if we focus on the downstream, larger, later benefits of this approach, then we may be more likely to encourage folks to adopt this particular approach. I don't know that we're supposed to jump right into concerns, Matt, but as I think about this from the perspective of a journal editor, there are a couple of things that are notable. And one of them has to do with the double anonymous review process that we adopt at Java. And one of the things that you pointed out, Matt, is that when you register a preprint, you get a DOI for that particular paper. So what happens then is when I try to assign a paper to a handling editor so that those reviewers can review an anonymous paper, if they were to, for example, search the title of that paper, they would then come across your DOI, which would then reveal your identity. So anonymity has been a primary concern. And very recently, I was fortunate to get a submission, and I was so excited, Matt, because they registered their data on OSF. And I was so excited to see that. And when I click the link in the anonymized manuscript, it takes me right to the author and that author's name and all of their study procedures. So from an anonymity perspective, I think that the approach has concerns. And so when I saw this paper come across my desk, I went back to your manuscript and I read and I thought, well, this is a problem we need to address. Matt and his co-authors say all you have to do is anonymize the data in the database. But keep in mind that it's already been available to everybody before that manuscript came to my desk. And then we had problems taking the identification tags off that person's pre-registration data. So ultimately, what we had to do is find a very significant workaround to this problem so that those authors' identities were not made public to the reviewers in this process. I can see you might want to respond to that. So go ahead, please.
Yeah. So, no, it's a good, I mean, that's a really, it's a really important issue. And I think in your process of editing the manuscript, you asked me that question, and I was thinking back to the answer that I gave you. And I think it was that, yeah, I mean, so this is pre-registration. It's kind of an emerging, there's an emerging technology that goes with it, if you will. And yeah, I mean, sometimes it might be challenging to anonymize the pre-registration because you're relying on the technology that's available through the registry to do that, whether that's the Open Science Foundation or whether that's REES. So yeah, that's something that could definitely be a barrier. I think if a reviewer is so inclined to or so motivated to figure out the identity of the authors of the paper, there are a whole variety of ways that they can do that. You could Google the title of the paper. You could look for a particular pattern of citations or whatever. You could look for a conference presentation. So I think we have to have a little bit of trust and faith in reviewers. Not to go looking not to, poke around and try to find the pre-registration. Although I think, as you're saying, if it's like somebody clicks on a link in the paper and that brings up the author's names, that's obviously that's not good.
You make a great point. We've noted for a long time, especially in the digital age, that you can search the ABAI program and find the title of a manuscript that was a poster in 2020 and is now a submission in 2024. So I understand what you're describing. There are ways in which you can kind of dig around and find stuff. My concern is the one that you pointed to, where we make it too easy.
Right.
And if it's just a link that directs you right to Matt Sikoria's project, then I know it was Matt Sikoria, and then that produces a series of challenges. Now, what we haven't yet,
I've produced a series of challenges for lots of people I've worked with, so that's a whole other podcast. But anyway.
But the matter of whether or not double anonymity is the right approach, I'm just putting that on the shelf for the moment and operating under the current Java contingencies, which are a system in which we recognize that. The other thing that from an editor, well, not so much an editor's perspective, but more as a scientist practitioner, is I hope that we can take this as an opportunity to attest to the value of the peer review process. And one additional concern from the scientist practitioner side is that as a scholar, as a sophisticated researcher, there's reason to believe that the work that you put in to preprint, for example, is going to be of a very high caliber and ultimately published in a peer-reviewed journal.
Mm-hmm.
Alternatively, once somebody puts something into a preprint format, in some respects, that is a piece of the literature at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes people put work in the ethos that may be counter-therapeutic, may not be internally or externally valid. So those aspects are, I suppose, a little concerning from the perspective of open science, but in the context of peer review, I want to make sure that we're making clear that this is an important dimension of the scientific process, and that, as you pointed out in your opening remarks, research gets better, presumably through having different perspectives of folks contribute to that work.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think as preprints sort of grow and take off in the scientific community generally, and in the ABA world specifically, I guess it's possible that folks could be putting work out there or publishing preprints that just don't represent rigorous work, but it gets recognized as a publication. I don't want to characterize the sort of preprints or science generally, but it seems like most of the folks who are publishing preprints now are folks who are pretty solid researchers who are then submitting it to a journal. Like, the whole point of it being a preprint is that you're subsequently submitting the paper to a journal. And it's hard to appraise these issues within ABA specifically, because there just aren't that, just by informal surveys that I've done at conferences, like, there aren't that many kind of ABAers or single case people who are, I would say it's a minority of folks who are doing these practices. So it's hard to map that onto the work that we do. But so I don't know that it's definitely a potential issue, and I don't want to, certainly don't want to suggest anything that's going to go against the blind anonymous peer review process that's very important. But yeah, I think you're highlighting a potential issue.
I think, I'm sorry, go ahead, Matt.
No, please, I'll follow on, but go ahead, John.
I think that this is the conversation that needs to happen. So I want to be clear in saying that identifying barriers and potential challenges does not mean we should stop the conversation.
Oh,
but
sure.
Rather, the conversation should lead to very thoughtful consideration about how we might address some of these challenges. So as I said in my communications to you when we were exchanging the manuscript, I have a lot of questions, and I'm not suggesting that I have to have satisfactory answers to all those questions at this point, but I imagine that if I have some of these questions, others do as well. So one potential benefit, I think, of putting a paper like yours in a journal like Java is that it will start a conversation, and we can start to address some of these things, some of these challenges, and time will tell what impact this approach is going to have on the literature. And I have a few other comments that I'd like to make, but I think it will change scientist behavior as well. And I really like the approach that you described earlier, describing meta-science issues, I believe was the phrase that you used. And I think focusing on how we as scientists and scholars approach the scientific process, that should evolve and change as well in light of some of these discussion points.
John, I think you hit the nail on the head where this is, we don't know all the answers, but this is an amazing way to start the conversation. So one thing I was thinking about, is, do you think at a certain point, this is total crystal ball territory, but I can imagine there might be some metrics of a particular scientist that might have like the ratio of pre-registrations to actual publications or preprints to actual publications. And this might kind of be a backdoor way of getting into some potential objections to this process of, hey, we started this study with these set of assumptions and, we had all, boy, did we learn a lot in this process. And one of the things we learned is that it didn't go the way we thought, and so we had to go back to the drawing board. So I could see through the best of intentions, people abandoning pre-registered studies, or maybe not abandoning is the right word. And again, this is probably an area where you could help us out in terms of elucidating some of these challenges with this. But, so I guess that there's a couple of parts of this question. And that one is that, what happens if you get into something and it doesn't pan out, and again, I'm not a scientist in the formal sense. I don't have a research program. I'm a 2-time doc program dropout. So, but I know enough to be dangerous. And I'm just curious what this would map onto the broader ABA or behavior analytics scientific community. It's been a while since I read Sidman, but I remember reading that book as a graduate student in Tom Critchfield's class, talking about how the scientist needs to be, and I'm paraphrasing here, needs to be sensitive to the various changes. There's no such thing as a pilot study. You're always learning, yada, yada, yada. And so in some respects, does this paint you into a corner because you don't have that flexibility that Sidman spoke to and others have spoken to over the years? And again, in a more meta science sense, are we going to someday rate scientists based off of like the correspondence between either pre-registration or preprints and the actual publication? And will that change how people do preprints and pre-registration? Have downstream effects in terms of all the contingency, the multiple layers of contingencies on the scientific process.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the misconceptions about pre-registration is that once you map out your research plan and you pre-register your study, is that you're then committed to it. You must do it, and if you don't do it that way, then you I don't know, you go to researcher timeout or something like that. And that's not the case. So there's the saying that pre-registration is a plan, not a prison. So you're outlining your plan, and if you need to update or change your plan, then you just you update the registration. So it's all about transparency. It's all about transparently communicating what you did and the rationales for what you did, if that information would be helpful in a reader interpreting your data and your study. And I would add too, I think, the idea, and I think that John's earlier comments sort of speak to this, we're encouraging people to pre-register in the paper, but we're not saying that you have to pre-register every study. There maybe are some types of studies. We talk about sort of the difference between exploratory and confirmatory studies a little bit. There maybe are certain kinds of studies that's probably better to pre-register. So for example, if you're comparing two established interventions to see which one, works better, it probably would be a good idea to pre-register that study. If you're doing more of an exploratory study, you're evaluating an intervention that's never been tested before, or you're applying you're trying to understand the basic processes underlying a new problem. Maybe you don't need to pre-register those studies as much, but you could accomplish if you transparently report in the manuscript all of these, various dimensions of decisions that you made. Pre-registering might not be necessary, but pre-registration provides a mechanism for the researchers to communicate their plan and what they've done and how they're and what decisions that they made during the study that might have deviated from that plan. So it's about transparency.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that point. I thought you did a nice job in the paper of outlining the aims and goals of the approach. So enhance scientific openness, researcher accountability, and then public access were the three that I recall you highlighting from the paper.
Mm-hmm.
You may have a sense of this. I think the word transparency has taken quite a bit of buzz in the popular culture of late. So folks want to know the inner workings of various processes and procedures. And what I like about this approach that you're taking is it's not transparency for the sake of transparency.
Mm-hmm.
It's transparency with a function, with a purpose. Right. And what I see as the function of this approach is that it requires scholars to be perhaps more specific and more definitive in articulating some of the decision-making processes that they use. So as an example, in the manuscript, you do a nice job of saying what were the conditions under which the baseline data were determined to be sufficiently stable to merit the introduction of the independent variable. If you sit in a research meeting with applied behavior analysts, you may hear, well, that looks good. Let's move on that. Mm-hmm. And without a specific articulation of the fact that the last 3 data points do not deviate by more than 5% of the last, and so on. So if we can articulate those things, then it makes the process a little bit more helpful, and it makes clearer to those who are interpreting and seeking to replicate that work what decisions and what decision-making processes went into place to produce the outcome that we see in the printed work finally.
Yeah, totally. And I would add to that another benefit of the pre-registration process, like when you're working in a research team, is having an opportunity. It occasions the opportunity for conversations about the type of issue that you mentioned, like, well, what are our criteria for baseline stability? And it's particularly helpful with students because you're ironing out, all the critical details of your research plan. And in doing so, you're maybe being more thoughtful about your approach than you would have been if you weren't going through the process. And it also occasions you to teach your students about these issues and being mindful about these issues and so on. So, yeah.
I'm curious, what was the response from the reviewers going through this? I'm sure either of you can, Matt primarily, I suppose, but John, I'm sure there might have been some thought put towards who to send this out to as far as AEs as well. So if both of you can take a crack at the review process here, I'm just curious to hear what your editorial colleagues thought about this paper, but the topic more generally.
Yeah, John might just think I'm saying this because he's here, but the editorial process was great. I mean, it was like great. Scott Arduin was the associate editor, and it was all the good things. Like, it was very, as is typical with Java, like very thorough and thoughtful reviews from the reviewers. As my doctoral advisor Tim Herron would say, Scott had a very sharp pen in terms of his just editing the manuscript, both in terms of copy editing and just overall flow and content. And I think as is reflected in this conversation, the reviewers ask these kinds of questions. Like, they ask the kinds of questions that we're talking about here. Like, well, does this apply to us? Or can you explain how this applies to us? And like, well, what about these drawbacks? How are you going to, how would you address them? And I think that they did a really nice job of anticipating the kinds of objections that would come from a Java audience. And they're the kinds of things that John is talking about. And I think it's largely a function of just this is new to many folks.
Have you gotten objections to this general topic outside of the paper submission? Just from talking to colleagues or talking about it maybe at conferences or what have you, assuming that you've been doing so. Have you come across people who are like incredibly skeptical of this? And if so, yeah, are you at liberty to describe such encounters?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I haven't encountered like strong like resistance, like no, no, like we shouldn't be doing this. I think what I've encountered is maybe skepticism and concern. like with open data sharing, for example, like if you just put all your data out there, like what are people gonna do with that? And I think there's also a fear too. There's a little bit of fear, and I think maybe that comes from some of the very high profile instances of research misconduct that have been documented lately. And if I don't know, Matt or John, if you follow like the research news, but I follow like there's a blog called Retraction Watch, and I kind of follow it. And there have been some really highly publicized examples of research misconduct where people have like lost their jobs, and there's a professor in the Harvard Business School who's was in the news. The president of Stanford University was, there was sort of a brouhaha involving him and altered figures in his lab. So I think people are somewhat concerned if they just put the information out there that, somebody, not to say that it's because they're engaging in misconduct or anything like that, but they just might have a fear that, like, and I mean, I've had this myself, like put this out there, like, well, did I analyze the data correctly? Am I putting all the data out there? I'm putting the right data out there. Like, you have like all these kinds of questions and concerns. And as you do things more transparently, I think that it brings those kinds of concerns more to the forefront. But I haven't encountered very strong resistance to it. I think the issue is more that folks are not, that we as kind of a research community, our verbal community at large, is not doing a lot of these things at this point. And so people just really want to know more and have these kinds of basic questions, that they might have answered.
John, I know you want to get in on this, but I just want to make a comment about Retraction Watch. So I'll put a link to Retraction Watch in the show notes. And I'm usually a big fan, but one thing happened, they covered a story that I'm not going to describe here on air, but and they did so wildly inaccurately, it made me question kind of all their other reporting. And I say that as a general fan of their work too. So it was like doubly disappointing. It's like, wow, how did you get that wrong? But that's, so again, I'll spare the audience from the specific details of this. And I know, it's one of those things, like, I think a lot of people, if they're close to any type of media story and know the actual players and the particulars to it, that sometimes when any type of media outlet tries to cover something, there's like, it just makes you wonder about the journalistic process in some cases. So, but that's my Retraction Watch anecdote.
I think the idea that folks are a little hesitant to share data is an important observation. And that's one that I have seen through the editorial process, wherein researchers ask other authors, other researchers for those data. And then there's a little bit of, hey, what are you going to do with that? I want to make the point that at JABA, under Wiley as our publisher, we have taken a number of steps that are intended to enhance open science. And one of those is to have this data availability statement that appears in what we refer to as the back matter, or right before the citations in a manuscript. And it's there where we're asking researchers to indicate whether they're willing to share their data and how to go about accessing those data, and what data would be shareable or what data are available to be shared. So that's one of those steps, I think, that it need not take place in place of data repository, for example, but it could be a yes and, where we make the data available by way of, emailing me and I can send you a series of files, or making it publicly accessible in one of these repositories as well. So I think that we're taking steps to ensure that people have access to as much information as possible.
That's a great point, John. I actually have a question for you about this, because I've noticed that journals, like when I submit manuscripts, journals are increasingly requiring the data. It seems like the data availability statement is now pretty much required of every journal, but I think some journals or some publishers are even going beyond that. So, like, for example, I submitted a paper to a Springer journal, and they asked me, I didn't include a data availability. Like, it used to be just like a box that you would check somewhere, but now they're like, we need the statement in the manuscript, and please refer to our policy. And when I looked at the publisher's policy, it was they're basically saying, like, it like if you are not making your data available, you need to explain why, or you should be explaining why. So it wasn't just like, are you making this available, but it seemed to be explicitly encouraging it. And I'm wondering if that's something that's coming down from the publishers generally because of all these sort of high profile sort of, incidents of like data fabrication and things like that we've been hearing about. Is this coming down from the publishers, or is this kind of a combination of editors and publishers getting together?
That's a very good question, and I appreciate the opportunity to explain that to the listeners. So Wiley has instituted a series of available options that editors are given the opportunity to accept or reject. So, for example, we've moved a lot of information. We've started to gather some information that we now include in our manuscripts, like a data availability statement. And to your point, it was always part of the submission process. So, for example, making sure that institutional review board approval has been obtained, making sure that individuals consented and that the processes were consistent with our institutional review board practices. All of that has been in the, as you note, boxes you check in the submission. And what we've tried to do is move that to the printed word. So you may be familiar that there was a point in time in which conflicts of interest became this kind of hot topic in our community. And it was always the case that conflict of interest statements were required as part of the submission process. What many uninformed individuals were not aware of is that information was always being collected. It just wasn't being shared on the public version. So in the spirit of transparency, it was putting that out there that the authors say, I have this particular potential conflict of interest. So in short, Wiley has said, hey, we have these things that we can include as part of the publication process. As editors, which of these would you like to take part in? And we jumped in on that. Another feature that is going to be forthcoming in the early part of 2025 is going to do with author contributions. So for those who may not understand this process, when you submit a paper through our portal for Wiley, you are asked to identify the roles of each contributing author on that manuscript. For now, that is behind the ScholarOne wall, but we'll be moving in 2025 to putting that information in the printed word so that we know, for example, Matt Tincani was responsible for the conceptualization and analyses, and this co-author was responsible for data analysis, for example. So we'll be moving towards some of these, I think, more open science approaches as we progress through 2025.
Yeah, I think that's great that you're going to be asking authors to delineate their contributions like that. I think that's really cool and good step.
The one thing I wanted to come back to as it relates to this process, Matt, is that I think one thing that this will do is over time, this should change the behavior of researchers. And I want to point out one example of where I think this need arises. When I'm preparing my introduction to a manuscript, I am currently not in the habit of perusing pre-registration websites to determine what's in the literature. And I may be unique in that regard. Perhaps everybody is searching these databases, but I don't think that's the case. So I think that ultimately, over time, this will result in some slightly modified behavior on the part of authors to find relevant literature as it relates to the topic that they're investigating. But right now, this is not in my current repertoire. I don't go to OSF to find out who's doing what on a particular topic, but presumably this will be some behavior that changes on the part of authors as this kind of open science approach unfolds.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that would be the goal, because it was you're planning your study, you're writing your manuscripts. Definitely good to have as much information as you can about what others are doing in that area, and whether there are, and it also could be an opportunity for collaboration with folks. Could set the occasion for a collaboration with folks who are doing similar work. It also might give you the opportunity to check out some similar data that have been collected. So yeah, I think that would sort of be a goal of us moving towards that. Because I mean, I'll admit I'm not doing it either very, very much, but that's to some extent a function of that there are not necessarily very many studies being pre-registered at this point, at least not single case studies. But I'm glad it's a great point to bring up, because I think we all should be mindful about doing that more.
John, one of the initial reaction I had to your comment about you not checking preprints in your scholarly work, my mind right away just clicked to like, good. Right. So I Matt, I know you made like the positive case for doing that in terms of collaboration, seeing what other work's out there and stuff like that. But I don't know, maybe I've just got like the knuckle dragging, conservative approach to going about these sorts of things. But if those preprints haven't gone through the peer review process, why would one do that? In terms of, because you'd have to, if you cited a preprint. And again, this is so abstract for me, because I don't do this type of work. But I would just imagine if I happened to be writing something where I was citing a preprint, I would have to note that it was a preprint, so as to not give the reader a false impression that this is a WADA 1982 like quality, or something like that, So I don't know. Am I off base here, or Am I going too far in my appraisal of these things?
No, I mean, I think it's a risk. It's a potential drawback, but I don't know that is necessarily the reality in other fields and disciplines where there are quite a few preprints. Don't hold me to that. But I would mention too that in terms of like looking for preprints, and I mean, this isn't necessarily a plug for Open Science Foundation. There are, a few different options that you have for archiving a preprint or for archiving a pre-registration. But if you publish your preprint through OSF, and OSF is linked with PsycArchive, which is a big preprint service, once you register that preprint, a DOI is generated and it's searchable in Google Scholar. Like, it's all linked up with Google Scholar. So if you're like, I'm partial to using Google Scholar to, like, when I'm doing literature reviews, and if it's a preprint that's been posted on OSF, you're going to find it. It's going to turn up in your search. But yeah, I hear you, Matt. I mean, that certainly is a risk. I do fair amount of kind of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research, and I don't recall seeing a lot of like citations to preprints and like in the papers that I come across. But yeah, it's a potential problem for. All right. It's a risk, I guess.
You can tell me I'm overreacting. That's totally fine.
You're totally overreacting.
Okay.
No, I'm kidding. No, I mean, maybe you're overreacting a little bit.
Yeah, it's not necessarily about the citations, but to come into contact with who's doing a similar kind of.
Well, that makes a lot more sense.
No, but to your point, Matt, I agree. I am pretty hesitant to see citations come through our Java papers that have not been exposed to peer review. As an example, it's not uncommon for folks to summarize, for example, posters that appear at an ABAI conference. So there was this poster on this topic, and that's all well and good, but because that has not been through the scientific peer review process, I conceptualize those as taking those findings with a grain of salt. And I think that we would want to be mindful of that. All I was suggesting is that as authors, we are increasing the number of resources that we have available. And as such, it should then result in a change in the kind of ways that we gather information. Now, what we do with that information, I think, should be conservative and consistent with the principles of the scientific process, but making others aware that these resources are available should dictate some sorts of changes in behavior moving forward.
There's a whole nother discussion of, what constitutes sometimes what's referred to as the gray literature. And I've even seen this podcast cited in journal articles, which on the one hand, I'm, incredibly flattered when people do that. And on the other hand, I'm like, this is something, that I've, for most of the episode recorded in my basement. And so I'm likewise, hoping people, to your point, John, take it with a grain of salt. So anyway, this is by far the wonkiest Inside Java series that we've done thus far, and I loved every bit of the conversation. The wonkiness notwithstanding, even though I don't navigate these waters, it's interesting nonetheless. So I just want to thank you guys for having such an interesting discussion on this topic. So I think we're coming close to the time we've allotted for this. So I want to, if there's any other kind of final word or wrap up that you guys want to mention about this, I want to give you the opportunity to do so.
Just looking at my notes, I think what I would encourage folks to do if they check out the paper is take a look at table 3 in the paper, which sort of is like a checklist for pre-registration. And if you look at that checklist, like, and there's other, I think, helpful figures in the paper. Like there's I think figure 1 is like just kind of like outlines the whole sort of like process. But if you look at table 3, I think that provides sort of like a helpful guidepost as to what information you should or could put in a study registration. But I also want to point out that if you look at the stuff that's in there, it's just stuff that should go into a good research proposal. So, and I say that to emphasize that, we're hopefully not asking for folks to do more work, or at least we're not asking them or not encouraging them to do more work in the sense of like, many additional steps. We're just encouraging people to document and make publicly known the stuff that would be in really any good research proposal. So yeah, I would encourage folks to check out table 3 and think about that.
If it's okay with the folks at Wiley, I might just excerpt table 3 and put it in the show note. Maybe just go to the behavioralobservations.com, folks. Just so anyway, we'll
I would just like to add that I'm really glad that JABA gets to be a part of this. I'm glad that this particular topic is being introduced for some folks or elaborated upon for the JABA readership. And as I said a few times probably today, the fact that there are questions should not be interpreted as strident objection to the approach, but rather should set the occasion for some very inquisitive and innovative solutions to the problems. And in my discussions with really smart colleagues about how to navigate the problem of anonymity, we have come up with what I think are pretty reasonable solutions, but they require the databases to be constructed in such a way so as to make these solutions easy. So for example, just making your registration go dark once the submission is in so that nobody can track that paper down is one easy way to do it, but you've got to have those repositories with that sort of on-off switch so that you can make something like that happen. I'm not suggesting that's the solution or perhaps the only solution, but coming up with ways to address the problem of anonymity, I think represents one of the most impactful barriers to, for example, a journal like JABA adopting this approach wholesale.
Mm-hmm.
All right, guys, thanks so much. And I did look it up while we were chatting here. This is the 21st Inside JABA Series podcast. So, boy, these are a lot of fun. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to share the good work of the flagship journal in our field.
Yeah.
So,
totally.
Matt, John,
thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Look forward to hearing more about this as it develops. Hey there, I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you want to get a CEU for it, go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs, and you can see where to pick up the CEU for this event, all the other Inside JABA Series podcasts, and many, many, many other of your favorite behavioral observations episodes. That's right. Many of these episodes we've repurposed for your continuing education needs. So if you want to learn while you're commuting, while you're at the gym, walking the dog, or whatever else you're doing, go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs to learn more. All right. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Cicoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.